He doesn't deserve to be my father.
Slap. A sharp, echoing crack cut through the luxurious atmosphere of a hotel in Lagos, a place meant for soft music and joyful applause. No one had time to process what just happened. Adewale Okoye, the groom in a flawless suit, had just slapped his powerful father, Chief Ibrahim Danjuma, right in the middle of his own wedding. The crystal glass slipped from his father's hand, shattered, just like the image of the perfect father everyone once believed in. The entire room froze. The bride, Zainab, stood motionless. Distinguished guests, those who once bowed in respect to Chief Ibrahim, now exchanged silent glances, barely daring to breathe. No one understood. Why would a son do the unthinkable on the most important day of his life? But the look in Adewale, sighs. It wasn't sudden anger. It was something deeper, colder, like a truth buried for far too long, finally rising to the surface. You have no right to speak about family. His voice was low, clear, steady, and in that moment, everyone began to realize this was no longer a wedding. This was a courtroom where the truth was about to be delivered. There are fathers who teach their sons how to succeed in the eyes of the world, but fail at being a good human being. And there are sons who must choose between silence to protect family honor or destroying everything to preserve their conscience. If you're rewatching this, stay until the very last second, because the story behind this slap will make you ask yourself, if it were me, would I have the courage to do the same? Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. Let's see how far this story has reached across the world. And if you believe that truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be told, justice, even when delayed, must still be served, hit subscribe now, because the next story might be the one that keeps you hooked from the very first second. In the eyes of all Lagos, Chief Ibrahim Danjuma was more than just a successful man. He was a symbol. His name stood on glass skyscrapers, on multi-million-dollar contracts, on charity galas, on conference stages where people spoke about ethics, family, and social responsibility. When he entered a room, the room itself seemed to change how it breathed. Conversations softened. Eyes turned toward him. No one needed to be told to respect him. They did it instinctively, because Chief Ibrahim possessed everything the world tends to bow to: power, wealth, discipline, composure, and above all, the reputation of a perfect father. After his wife, Mama Ngozi, passed away when Adewale was still very young, he never remarried. At least, that was the story people told. They spoke of him with admiration, as if describing a living saint. A man who lost the love of his life, but refused to fall apart. A father who buried his grief in work, buried his loneliness in silence, buried his personal desires to focus on one singular purpose: raising his son. And indeed, Adewale Okoye grew into a man who seemed to validate every word of praise ever spoken about his father. He attended the best schools. He spoke with a calm, grounded voice, carried himself with the composure of someone trained to control his emotions at all times. He wasn't loud or reckless like many privileged sons in Lagos. No scandals, no controversies, no arrogance. He was polished, reserved, intelligent, ambitious, but never showy. A younger, more modern, more refined version of his father. People looked at the two of them and called it a legacy, a family legend. Proof that if a man is strong enough, he doesn't just build an empire in the world. He builds a perfect here. But every legend comes with a cost, and the more flawless a legend appears, the more it tends to hide. Adewale's childhood unfolded in a vast home where nothing was missing except real answers. He had nannies, tutors, drivers, crisp uniforms pressed to perfection, scheduled dinners, strict lessons on posture, table manners, eye contact, and how never to let others see your weaknesses. Chief Ibrahim taught his son carefully. He taught him how to shake hands warm, but never submissive, how to stay silent, while others revealed their own shallowness, how a man could be disliked, envied, but never disrespected. He taught Adewale how to succeed before he ever taught him how to be happy. And Adewale, like any boy craving his father's approval, absorbed those lessons as if they were the only definition of love he had ever been given. Because Chief Ibrahim was not the kind of man who hugged his son easily. He wasn't gentle. He wasn't soft. He wasn't the type to sit by a bedside telling stories or brushing his son's hair when he was afraid. His love, if it was love, was measured in paid tuition, opened doors, harsh but practical lessons. He didn't often say, "I'm proud of you," but when Adewale did well, he would nod just once. And that alone was enough to make the boy feel accomplished for days. As for Mama Ngozi, the house spoke of her in a strange way, half reverence, half avoidance. Adewale grew up with only fragments of memory, a soft scent on her wrist, a quiet lullaby in the night, a gentle hand on his forehead when he was sick, a warm but fleeting laugh, as if her time in his life had never been long enough to become a complete memory. When he was young, he once asked, "What illness did Mom have?" Chief Ibrahim had been reading the newspaper. He did look up immediately. His answer came after a brief pause, short, but long enough for the child to feel he had touched something forbidden. A serious illness. What kind of illness? You don't need the details. Can I see pictures of her in the hospital? That's not necessary. Every question about Mama Ngozi ended the same way. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with a wall cold, clean, unbreakable. Eventually Adewale stopped asking, not because his curiosity faded, but because he learned very early that in this house, some pain was allowed to exist and some was locked away by power. As the years passed, that silence grew with him. At school, his friends talked about visiting their grandmothers, spending summers with their mother's family, eating dishes only their maternal relatives could make. Adewale had none of those stories. He knew nothing about Mama Ngozi's side of the family, not where she was born, not whether she had siblings, not why no one from her side had ever appeared at any milestone in his life, not at graduations, not at birthdays, not at his engagement, not a letter, not a call, as if she had entered his father's life from nowhere, given birth to him, and then vanished without leaving roots behind. As a child, he accepted it. As a teenager, he found it strange. As an adult, he began to find it frightening. Meanwhile, outside, the legend of Chief Ibrahim only grew stronger. He appeared on television funding educational programs. He spoke about family values to rooms full of young entrepreneurs. He talked about honor as if he understood it down to its deepest fiber. He spoke of sacrifice as if no one else truly knew its cost. And in public, he always seemed sincere, dangerously sincere. Never theatrical. Never obviously fake. Just a calmness that felt controlled. The calmness of a man who had spent a lifetime managing his own image. Adewale believed him, almost completely, until one evening, a few months before the wedding. That night, Lagos was hit by a heavy storm. Wind lashed against the glass walls of the old mansion. The power flickered, turning the long hallways colder than usual. Adewale returned late from a meeting and stepped into the storage room, intending only to find some documents related to an old project his father had once assigned to him. He wasn't looking for secrets, at least, not at first. But as he pulled open an old wooden drawer, he noticed the base felt unusually thick. Instinct made him pause. He tapped lightly. A hollow sound answered. Not solid wood. He crouched down, ran his fingers along the edge. A thin panel shifted. Beneath it lay a yellowed envelope. No name, no seal, as if it had been hidden in haste or in fear. The moment he picked it up, something inside him shifted. A feeling that only comes when you're holding something capable of changing everything you believe about the past. He pulled out the paper. The handwriting was soft, slightly trembling, a woman's hand. The first line stopped his blood cold. If one day you read this letter, it means I never had the chance to tell you the truth myself. Adewale read it again and again. Each word struck like a hammer against the part of his memory he had avoided for years. He hadn't even finished reading when footsteps echoed in the hallway. Slowly, steady, familiar. His father. By instinct, Adwale folded the letter and slipped it inside his jacket. The door opened. Chief Ibrahim stood there under the dim yellow hallway light upright, composed, as always. His eyes moved from his son to the open drawer. Just for a moment, but it was enough. For the first time, Adwale saw something he had never clearly seen before. Caution. "What are you looking for?" his father asked. "Some old files. I'll have someone find them." "No need. I can handle it." The silence between them stretched tight like wire. Then Chief Ibrahim nodded. "Done T stay here long." It's damp. He turned and left. The door closed. But in that moment, another door opened inside Adwale, and it would never close again. From that night on, he began to read. He read the letter in silence. Read it again until he knew it by heart. Read it as a son standing between two worlds. On one side, the father he had respected his entire life. On the other, the voice of his dead mother, soft, but sharp enough to cut through years of buried truth. He no longer looked at his father the same way. He still called him father, still sat beside him in meetings, still appeared with him in public, still allowed Legos to believe the family was flawless. But in his eyes, what used to be respect had transformed into something else. Colder, heavier, more dangerous. It was no longer the gaze of a son. It was the gaze of a man, standing at the edge of truth, knowing that one more step could bring everything down. And now, on that dazzling wedding night, as Chief Ibrahim raised his glass and spoke about family in his familiar, dignified tone, no one but Adwale knew that every word was tearing open a wound already bleeding. No one but him knew that behind the image of the perfect father, there might be an entirely different man, a man who had survived for years on the silence of others. And the most terrifying part wasn't what he had hidden. It was how close he had come to getting away with it. If not today, if not here, if not for the moment when Adwale finally stopped looking at his father with gratitude, then perhaps all of Lagos would have continued believing in a legend built on power, fear, and a death that had never been told truthfully. Right now, beneath the crystal lights and clinking glasses, Adwale was no longer standing there as a groom listening to his father speak. He stood there as the final witness, and in his eyes, there was no respect left, only the truth, waiting to be exposed. From the time he was a child, Adwale had learned not to ask too many questions. Not because he wasn't curious, but because in that house, every question had its limit, and that limit always seemed to involve his mother, Mama Ngozi. A name spoken with respect but never with detail. No medical records, no doctors, no hospital. Not a single medical file existed in any system that a powerful family like theirs could not have accessed. And the strangest part, no one from his mother's side had ever appeared. No grandmother, no aunt, no congratulatory phone call, no flowers sent on important occasions. As if that woman had entered Chief Ibrahim's life out of nowhere. And when she disappeared, every trace of her had been erased as well. When he was younger, Adwale used to try piecing together the few memories he had. A gentle voice, a warm embrace, a lullaby with words he could never quite make out. But every time he tried to remember more, his memory seemed to hit an invisible wall. Not because he had forgotten, but because someone had never wanted him to remember. As the years passed, the feeling that something was wrong never disappeared. It simply changed shape, from an innocent question, into a quiet suspicion, then into an emptiness he could not fill. He tried searching once. At one point, when he was old enough to access hospital archives himself, he searched for his mother's name. No results. He tried different variations. No results. He searched by date. Still nothing. It wasn't that the data was missing. It was that it had never existed. Another time, he hired a private investigator. Not publicly. No trail. Just a quiet request. Find out who my mother's family was. 3 days later, the investigator backed out. No reason. No explanation. Just a refund. And then he disappeared. After that, Adwale stopped searching. Not because he gave up, but because he understood. Some truths cannot be reached through ordinary means, and if he wanted answers, he would have to wait. 1 week before the wedding, Lagos had entered the hot season, the air thick and heavy as if holding in every secret left unspoken. That evening, Adwale was in his private office, finalizing the last details of the grand event the whole city was waiting for. His phone vibrated. A new email. No sender name. No subject line. Just a strange address, long, random, impossible to trace. Adwale stared at the screen for a few seconds. A feeling he could barely name moved down his spine. Not fear, not exactly curiosity, but recognition, as if he had been waiting for this email for a very long time without ever knowing it would come. He opened it. No greeting, no explanation, no signature. Just one sentence. The truth about your mother was never told. Below it was an attachment, a video. Adwale didn't open it right away. He set the phone down on the desk, looked at the black screen reflecting his own face, and in that moment, he knew. If he pressed play on that video, his life would never return to what had been. The room was so quiet, he could hear the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, like a countdown. At last, he touched the screen. The video opened. The image shook slightly. Low quality. The angle was crooked, as if it had been recorded in haste or in secret. A room. Dim lighting. A cramped space. Nothing like any room in the mansion he knew now. And then, he saw her. Mama Ngozi. Not in the carefully framed photographs. Not as the gentle woman in his faded memories, but as a woman. Weak. Struggling to breathe. Begging. Please take me to the hospital. Her voice was hoarse. Her breathing broken. Her trembling hand clutched the edge of the table. Adwale felt his heart tighten. He had never seen his mother like that. Never. He had never been allowed to. The camera trembled slightly. Then a figure stepped into view. He didn't need to see the face clearly. Adwale recognized him immediately. Chief Ibrahim. Younger, but unmistakable, he stood there, looking at his wife, not rushing, not panicking, not reaching for a phone, not calling a doctor, just standing there, as if weighing something in his mind. Please, Mama Ngozi whispered again, weaker this time, almost hopeless. Chief Ibrahim stepped closer, not to help, but to lean down and say one sentence. His voice was calm in a way that turned cold in Adwale's bones. We do not have time for this. The video stopped. Abruptly, the screen turned black. No next clip, no conclusion. Just one moment. But it was enough to destroy everything. Adwale sat motionless. The phone was still in his hand, but he could no longer feel its weight. Inside his head, memories began colliding with one another. The clipped answers, the unnatural silences, the non-existent records, the relatives who had never appeared. All of it rearranged itself into a new image, an image he had never dared imagine. His mother had not died from illness, but maybe she had been left to die. A dangerous thought, cruel, unbearable, and impossible to dismiss. Adwale opened the video again, watched it once more, then again, and again. Each time he noticed another detail. His father's eyes. Not the eyes of a helpless man, but the eyes of someone who had made a decision. That night, Adwale did not sleep. He sat in the dark until morning. No lights, no calls, no questions. Because deep inside him, one thing had become clear. This was not something you ask about. This was something you confront. In the days that followed, he continued preparing for the wedding. He still met with business partners, still smiled, still appeared in front of the press, still stood beside his father as if nothing had happened. No one noticed, no one suspected, because Adwale was exceptionally skilled at control, just like the man who had taught him how. But inside, everything had changed. He no longer looked at his father the same way. He no longer listened to speeches about morality the same way. He no longer believed the story all of Lagos still believed. He began to wait for a moment, wait for a place, wait for a setting where the truth could not be hidden. And then he realized there was no more perfect place then. His own wedding day, the one place where everyone would be present, the one place where no one could turn away, the one place where, once spoken. The truth could never be buried again. From the moment he watched that video, Adwal was no longer preparing for a wedding. He was preparing for a trial. And the only thing he still did not know was, when the truth came out, what would he lose first? His family, or the man he had always believed himself to be? The entire ballroom was still frozen in the aftermath of the slap. No one even knew when the music had stopped. The sound of the shattered wineglass still seemed to linger somewhere in the air, like a crack that had not yet sealed. Distinguished guests stood motionless beneath the crystal chandeliers, champagne flutes still in hand, lips parted, but not a single word came out. The bride, Zainab, was going paler by the second. The MC stood near the stage, one hand gripping his stack of cue cards, so tightly he did not dare move. Even the security team at the back of the hall had hesitated, as if they themselves were no longer sure who was supposed to be restrained. Chief Ibrahim was still standing there. One hand rose slowly to the side of his face where he had been struck. The gesture was small, deliberate, not because it hurt, but because he could not quite believe it had actually happened. For years, he had been the man who made others lower their voices, the man who could change an opponent's posture with a single look, the man all of Lagos had learned to greet with lowered heads before they could even think about it. And now, in the middle of his son's wedding, in front of the city's elite, he had just been slapped across the face by his only child. But what chilled the room was not the slap. It was the look in Adwale's eyes after it. No panic, no recklessness. Nothing about him looked like a man who had just lost control. He stood tall in his black tuxedo, shoulders steady, breathing even. One hand had fallen back to his side, while the other gripped a small black remote. The groom's face was still handsome, still composed in a way that felt almost terrifying. Only his eyes had changed completely. In them, there was nothing left of a son being swept away by emotion. There was only the absolute clarity of a man who had gone all the way through doubt, pain, and disbelief, and had finally chosen not to stay silent. Adwale turned. He did not look at his father again. He faced the giant LED screen hanging behind the stage, the screen that only minutes earlier had been meant to play romantic engagement photos, congratulatory video messages, beautifully staged memories, designed to open the night of a perfect marriage. Now it was black, like a door about to open into the hell of a family's buried truth. Adwale's voice rang out, low, clear. Each word dropped like steel onto stone. You have no right to speak about family. No one dared breathe too loudly. A woman at one of the tables, near the stage, raised her hand to her mouth, without realizing it. An older businessman who had been laughing with Chief Ibrahim only moments earlier now stared down into his glass, as if he could not bear to be the first person to see what came next. A few whispers tried to rise, then died immediately. The entire room sank into that heavy kind of silence that only comes when the truth has not yet been revealed, but everyone can already feel will be enough to destroy everything. At last, Chief Ibrahim spoke. Adwale. His voice still carried its familiar calm, but it had dropped lower now. What exactly are you doing? Adwale did not turn back. For the briefest moment, he closed his eyes, as if steadying himself. When he opened them again, the last traces of hesitation were gone. I wanted this to be a lie, he said, his gaze fixed on the dark screen. I watched it dozens of times, hoping there would be one detail, just one, that proved I had misunderstood. But there wasn't. His thumb pressed the button. The LED screen came alive. Every head in the ballroom lifted at once. The image that appeared was grainy. The frame trembled slightly. The colors washed out. Every outline blurred, as though time itself had been gnawing at the footage. It was clearly old, something from an early surveillance camera, filmed from a high, crooked angle, with the faint visual interference of dust clinging to memory. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. A room, not large. The lighting was dim and yellow, quiet and suffocating. It did not look like a hospital room. There were no doctors, no nurses, no beeping machines, just a private room of some kind, expensive enough not to be ordinary, but secluded enough to be cut off from the outside world. Then the figure on the bed came into focus. The woman, weak, lying on her side on wrinkled white sheets. Her hair clung damply to her forehead. Her breathing was shallow and strained. Her chest rose and fell with visible effort, as if each breath cost her something. One hand clutched the blanket, the other trembled against her chest, as though her own body had become too heavy to bear. No one in the ballroom needed an explanation. Even though the years in the footage had drained life from her face, even though illness had reduced her to a fragile shadow, there was a softness in her features that could not be mistaken. Mama Ngozi, the woman all of Lagos had been told died from a tragic illness. The woman who, for years, had existed only in the carefully framed portraits hanging in Chief Ibrahim's house. The woman who was now appearing before them not as an idealized memory, but as a real human being in the act of dying. Somewhere in the room, a strangled gasp broke loose. On the screen, Mama Ngozi moved faintly. Her lips parted very slowly. Her throat must have been burning dry, because even forming words looked like an agony. Ibrahim, she whispered, just 2 syllables, but they made several hands around the room begin to shake. Please, her breathing faltered, her eyes searching towards something outside the frame, as if clinging to a final thread of hope. Take me to the hospital. The atmosphere in the ballroom turned cold. No one could hold on to social composure anymore. The women who had only moments earlier been fixing their hair and smoothing their gowns now stood motionless, as if nailed to the marble floor. A few of the men glanced reflexively at Chief Ibrahim, then quickly looked away, as though even that glance now felt like an accusation. The camera did not move right away. It recorded several long, suffocating seconds in which Mama Ngozi struggled for air, her eyes dim with pain, her lips trembling as though she wanted to beg again, but no longer had the strength. Then the angle caught movement. A man stepped into frame, tall, well-dressed, rigid posture, cold. No one in the room needed to see more to know who it was. Chief Ibrahim Danjuma, much younger than the man now standing in the ballroom. His hair was darker then. His face carried fewer lines, but that only made it more horrifying, because the man in the video and the man standing in front of them now were unmistakably the same. Impossible to deny, impossible to dismiss as resemblance, impossible to call a cheap fabrication. It was him. In the old footage, Chief Ibrahim stood no more than a few steps from the bed. He did not rush forward. He did not kneel. He did not call for help. He did not reach for a phone. He did not run to the door and shout for a doctor. He simply stood there. His face did not change. His eyes were not wild, not frightened, not grief-stricken like a husband watching his wife struggle between life and death. His expression was calm in a way that felt monstrous, the calm of a man who was not surprised by what was happening, the calm of a man whose priorities were already somewhere else. Mama Ngozi forced her head up slightly, as if afraid that if she did not speak now, she would never get another chance. Ibrahim, her voice cracked apart. I can breathe. In the ballroom, Zainab took half a step backward, her hand flying to her chest, as if someone had squeezed the air from her lungs. Her mother sank into the nearest chair, because her knees could no longer hold her. One older guest, a longtime business associate of Chief Ibrahim's, frowned so hard his entire face seemed to change. On the screen, Chief Ibrahim finally spoke. His voice was not loud, not harsh, not violent in the way people usually imagine cruelty. It was worse than that because it was spoken in a tone so measured, so thoughtful. It sounded almost annoyed at being interrupted. We cannot stop the project over this. No one in the ballroom moved. No one blinked. The room seemed to freeze around the sentence. It was not merely a refusal. It was a verdict. A short sentence placing his wife's life beneath business timelines, beneath profit, beneath ambition, beneath something called a project, and saying it all with the cold assurance of a man who did not believe he had done anything wrong. The screen stayed lit for a few more seconds. Mama Gozi looked at him. She no longer had the strength to beg, and in her eyes then, there was not only pain, there was the breaking of the last piece of trust she had left. Then the video stopped. Black. No ending. No explanation. No text on the screen. Only darkness, reflecting the faces of hundreds of guests standing beneath the chandeliers in stunned silence. What followed was even more terrifying than the first slap, because now no one could cling to doubt anymore. No one could comfort themselves by thinking Adewale was simply rebelling, losing control, destroying his wedding over a moment of madness. The truth had appeared before them, raw, cold, unadorned. Chief Ibrahim stood motionless in the middle of the ballroom, light falling across his face. For the first time in years, he no longer looked like a monument. He looked like a man, stripped of the glossy coating of power, revealing the flesh and bone underneath. And what lay beneath was more frightening than any rumor. Adewale still stood with his back to the screen. His hand around the remote was clenched so hard his knuckles had gone white. He was not trembling from fear. He was trembling because he had forced himself to do the one thing no son ever wants to do. Turn his own wedding into the burial ground of his father's legend. No one in the ballroom dared speak, because there are moments when language becomes too small for the weight of truth. And that night, in a luxury hotel in Lagos, beneath crystal chandeliers and among expensive gowns and polished shoes, an entire city was no longer witnessing a wedding. They were witnessing a secret buried for years, clawing its way back to life with its own hands. No one said a word. After the lead screen went dark, the entire ballroom seemed to sink beneath a sheet of invisible ice. There was no more clinking of silverware against glass. No more chairs shifting. No more of the polished social noise that usually coated every high society event like a flawless layer of varnish. There was only silence, heavy, dense, freezing, pressing against every chest in the room. A few guests stepped back on instinct. No one signaled it. No one told anyone to move. But they all felt the same thing, the distance between themselves and Chief Ibrahim Danjuma. The man once regarded as the pillar of honor had suddenly become the distance of revulsion. Expensive shoes brushed softly against the marble floor, making the faintest sounds, but in that deathly quiet, they rang out like cracks spreading through a statue breaking from the inside. Near the front row, Zainab lifted a hand to her mouth. Her hand shook so badly that her engagement ring kept catching the chandelier light. The eyes of the woman who was supposed to become Adewale's wife were wide with horror. She wasn't crying. Not yet. What she had just seen was still too large for tears. It struck the mind before it could even reach the heart. She looked at the dark screen, then at Adewale, then at the man she had, just minutes earlier, respectfully thought of his family. No more precisely, the man she had believed would become the most honorable father-in-law in Lagos. Now, before her, that symbol was gone. All that remained was a face, still trying to hold the shape of power, while the truth had stripped it bare in front of everyone. Chief Ibrahim stood motionless. For years, he had built his entire life on a form of cold discipline, so absolute it almost felt inhuman. He understood the value of image. He understood how to control a room. He understood that in moments of crisis, the winner is not always the innocent one, but the one who keeps his composure longer than the other person. And now he was doing exactly that. His chin lifted slightly. His shoulders remained straight. One hand hung by his side, the other briefly tightening into a fist before opening again, a small movement, as if reminding his body that it still answered to him. He looked around the room, at the faces that had once admired him, the partners who had once chased his approval, the women who had used his name as an example of loyalty and responsibility. Now every one of those eyes had changed. No one was looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him. The people look at a crack that has suddenly appeared in a bridge they trusted with their entire lives. At last, Chief Ibrahim spoke. "That is only a misunderstanding." He said it slowly, trying to keep his voice full and low the way it always was. But from the very first word, everyone heard what perhaps even he himself realized. His voice had lost its weight, not because he was speaking more softly, but because his words no longer stood on the foundation of credibility, the credibility of a man whose reputation had been built on stories of morality, sacrifice, and honor. Once that foundation collapses, the voice may still sound the same, but it becomes nothing more than the sound of a man trying to cling to the last scraps of himself. "You do not understand the context of that moment," he continued, forcing his breath back into rhythm. "That video does not show the full story." But no one nodded. No one stepped in to defend him. No one laughed awkwardly to rescue the atmosphere the way people often do when they want to protect an important man from public humiliation. Because the issue was no longer whether the video was complete. The issue was the look in his eyes, that inhuman calm. The line he had spoken, "We cannot stop the project over this." A short sentence, but it landed like a blade driven straight through the heart of the legend that had sustained his name for so many years. A man at a table to the right slowly set down his glass. Not hard, but the soft sound of crystal touching wood still made several people flinch. He was a long-time investor who had publicly praised Chief Ibrahim many times before. Now he only glanced at the person beside him, his expression saying what his mouth could not. "It's over." An older woman in the front row lowered herself into her chair, as if her knees could no longer bear the shock. She remembered having cried once, while listening to Chief Ibrahim speak of his late wife at a fundraiser for cancer patients. At the time, she thought she was looking at a faithful husband who had turned grief into grace. Now that memory came back like a second slap. Many people in the ballroom felt the same way. They were not only shocked by the video, they were shocked by the realization that they had believed him, admired him, helped elevate him onto a pedestal, without ever knowing what had been underneath. On the stage, Adwale remained still. He did not interrupt his father. He did not lash out. He no longer needed to. The truth had already done the hardest part for him. He simply stood there, angled slightly, his eyes fixed on his father. But it was no longer the look of a son waiting for an explanation. It was the look of someone who had crossed the final border of disappointment. A disappointment so deep it had moved beyond ordinary anger. What remained was cold, cold as stone, cold as the last breath of a buried faith. Chief Ibrahim felt it. He turned toward Adwale, trying to pull that old thread of authority between father and son back into place. "You do not understand what you are doing," he said, lowering his voice, lacing it with the familiar warning that had silenced people for years. "You are letting emotion turn you into the one destroying your own family." Adwale looked at him for a long time. Then he answered, so quietly the entire room had to hold its breath to hear him. "This family was destroyed a long time ago." A shiver seemed to move through the crowd, because that was not the voice of a rebellious son. It was the voice of a man who had lived too long among ruins, and was only now calling them by their proper name. Zainab slowly lowered her hand from her mouth. Her lips trembled. She wanted to say something, to object, to ask, to deny, to reach for any explanation that might still save this night. But then she looked at Chief Ibrahim's face again, and every word died where it was born. There was no pain in his eyes of a man falsely accused, no devastation of a betrayed father. There was only calculation moving rapidly beneath the rigid surface of his expression. He was measuring damage, looking for openings, trying to rebuild the narrative, and that frightened everyone more than the video itself. Because when a man is still thinking about his image at the very moment the truth about his wife's death has been dragged into the light, then perhaps the video had not even reached the deepest part of his coldness. A younger male guest stepped farther back, as if unwilling to remain too close to the radius of collapse. Two women seated together, whispered something under their breath, then fell silent the instant Chief Ibrahim turned his head slightly. The habit of fearing him was still there, but it was no longer respect. It was fear of a man who had finally been seen clearly. The chandeliers overhead still burned bright. The wedding band's instruments still sat there, polished and useless. The towering wedding cake still stood untouched in the far corner, iced in flawless white, beautiful in a way that now felt meaningless. Everything from a perfect night was still there. Everything except honor. That was gone. Not the kind of broken that can be picked up, glued back together, and carried out before the public with a rehearsed apology. The kind of broken that, once it happens, people will hear forever whenever his name is spoken. Chief Ibrahim Danjuma. Before tonight, that name meant power, prestige, standards. After tonight, it would be tied to a single question Lagos would never forget. Did that man truly stand there while his wife begged for help and choose a project over her life? In the eyes of the room now, he was no longer a father, no longer a faithful husband, no longer a moral figure for the press to praise or society to quote. He was a man who had weighed the life of the woman beside him against his own interests, and had not hesitated to choose profit, choose work, choose ambition, choose the thing that helped him build his empire. And the woman left behind had been turned into a beautiful story, used for years to serve his image. That was why no one in the ballroom could speak, not only because they were horrified, but because everyone was asking themselves the same thing. How many of his words over the years had been true? How many speeches about honor had only been paint? How many times had he spoken publicly of Mama Ngozi, while really using her death to polish himself? At the back of the ballroom, a young server stood motionless beside a tray of untouched champagne. He had once looked at these wealthy guests with admiration, but tonight he suddenly understood something painfully simple that many people spend their whole lives avoiding. Not everyone who speaks often about honor actually has any. Not everyone who stands tall before a crowd is free of reasons to bow before their own conscience. And sometimes the more magnificent an empire looks, the worse the rot buried underneath it smells. Adwale's jaw tightened. He was not happy, not triumphant. There was no victory in his eyes, because a son, even when he reveals the truth, cannot truly win when that truth kills the last surviving image of his father. But some truths, if left unspoken, go on poisoning everything around them. And tonight, in the middle of his own wedding, Adwale had chosen to cut that poison out of his family, even knowing the price would be blood. The ballroom remained still. No one could save Chief Ibrahim now, because there are moments when honor does not collapse under accusation. It collapses under the truth in the eyes of the person who once stood closest to you. And that night, beneath the blazing lights of a luxury wedding in Lagos, Chief Ibrahim Danjuma finally understood what money, power, and fear could never save him from. A man may control the world for years, but it takes only one moment for the truth to rise again, and everything he built over a lifetime can come crashing down in seconds. Adwale stepped forward, slowly, without rushing. This was no longer the eruption of that first slap that had torn the wedding apart. This time, every step he took was so deliberate that people had the strange feeling they could hear the leather of his shoes touching the marble floor like the ticking of a sentence drawing near. The entire ballroom seemed to part on its own, leaving an invisible space between him and Chief Ibrahim, as if no one dared stand between the place where blood, guilt, and truth were about to collide, head-on. The crystal lights above still blazed. The wedding music remained silent. The setting was still luxuriously perfect. But now all that elegance served only as the backdrop for the most stripped, naked moment of a family's life. Adwale stopped just a few steps away from his father. The distance was small enough that a father should have been able to reach out and touch his son. But tonight, it felt as wide as an abyss. Chief Ibrahim remained standing straight. He had tried to preserve the posture of a man who had not fallen. His shoulders were still squared, his chin still raised, his eyes still trying to hold on to that cold edge of authority he had once used to make all of Lagos listen. But beneath the unforgiving light of the ballroom, that control was beginning to crack. A muscle flickered near his temple. The hand at his side clenched and loosened again. His breathing was no longer steady. It was the first time that night that he looked like a man who was afraid. Not afraid of scandal, not afraid of the press, but of something more primal, afraid to stand before a witness who would no longer bow his head. Adwale looked directly into his father's eyes, without blinking, without turning away. When he spoke, his voice was low and clear, as if every word had been forged in fire for years before being released into this room. "You did not kill my mother with a knife." The entire ballroom froze. No one moved. No one dared let a glass touch the table. A few guests instinctively held even their breathing still, as though exhaling too hard might shatter the unbearable tension stretched through that moment. Adwale did not stop. His eyes remained locked on the man before him. "You killed her," he continued, slower now, stressing each word as if carving it into stone. With indifference, the sentence dropped into the ballroom like a hammer. Not loud, not theatrical, but powerful enough to crush every excuse still left standing. Because a knife can be called a moment of violence. A gunshot can be called a crime of sudden impulse. But indifference, that is a cold choice, conscious, deliberate. It is when a person sees another life fading right in front of him and still decides not to save it. Chief Ibrahim swallowed. It was a small movement, but the whole ballroom saw it. The man who had once controlled every room he entered could no longer fully control his own body. His lips parted as if he meant to speak, but his voice seemed trapped somewhere in his throat. Every word that had once helped him build an empire had suddenly become useless in the face of a truth that simple. Adwale took another step, just one. But it was enough to make several people in the room hold their breath even harder. "You stood there," his voice sank lower, heavy as iron, "and watched her die." In the minds of many, the footage from the screen came rushing back, like a nightmare that refused to leave. Mama Ngozi on the bed, breath breaking apart, eyes begging, trembling fingers clutching at the blanket, as if she were trying to hold on to life, with the last strength left in her. And Chief Ibrahim not panicking, not calling for help, not collapsing in despair like a husband who loved his wife, simply standing there with the expression of a man, calculating what mattered more. Adwale tightened his jaw. "While you were thinking about contracts and money." Below the stage, a woman broke into tears and then quickly covered her mouth. An older businessman turned his face away entirely, unable to keep watching. Zainab stood motionless, one hand against her chest, her eyes red but no longer able to produce tears. The shock had gone beyond the reach of crying. She looked at the man she had been about to marry, then at the man who had almost become her father-in-law, and understood that from this night forward, nothing in her life would ever mean quite the same thing again. At last, Chief Ibrahim forced himself to speak. Adwale, his voice had gone hoarse, stripped of the authority that had once silenced entire boardrooms. "It is not as simple as you think." But the sentence died as soon as it entered the air, because no one wanted to hear about complexity anymore. There are many things in life that are complicated, but when a dying woman looks at her husband and begs to be taken to a hospital, morality is no longer a philosophical debate. It becomes one question only: do you save her or not? And that night, Chief Ibrahim had answered by doing nothing. Adwale let out the faintest laugh. Not a laugh of mockery, but the laugh of someone who had finally heard with his own ears what his heart had known for a long time. The man standing before him could no longer be rescued by excuses. "When I was a child," he said, his voice lowering, and the lower it went, the more painful it became, "I thought you were the strongest man I knew." The ballroom remained utterly still. "You taught me how to walk into a room." and make people respect me. He looked directly at his father. You taught me never to bow to anyone. A short silence passed. But you never taught me how to live with knowing that my father let my mother die. The words seemed to suck the air out of the room. This was no longer accusation. This was something torn, straight, out of a human soul and laid open in front of hundreds of people. There is nothing more terrifying than pain once it stops hiding behind politeness. Adwale stepped forward again, close enough now that only a few inches separated them. Tonight, he said, very slowly, I did not slap you because I was angry. Chief Ibrahim went still. A few guests glanced at one another, not understanding why that line made them feel colder than everything that had come before it. Because anger can be explained away. Anger can pass. Anger is a fire. But what was in Adwale's eyes now was not fire. It was the ruthless clarity of a man who had crossed through pain and become a witness. He continued, I slapped you, then paused for half a beat, forcing the entire room to hear the full cost of what came next. Because this is the first time you have had to face the truth. The sentence nailed the whole wedding night to the ground. Chief Ibrahim shifted back, only slightly, but that single movement said more than any defense ever could. All his life, he had been the one who made others step back. Now in front of his son, in front of the video, in front of hundreds of eyes withdrawing their final scraps of respect from him, he was the one stepping away, not because of physical force, but because of truth. That was the one thing in his life he could not buy, manipulate, or threaten. Adwale felt a sharp H in his chest. No one could see it, but standing here and speaking these words felt like tearing apart the last remains of his own childhood with his bare hands. Every sentence killed another old version of himself, the version of the boy who once waited for his father's nod to feel worthy, who once believed all the silence around his mother existed only because the grief was too painful to name, who once admired the man before him like an unshakable mountain. Now he knew that mountain had not been built from stone. It had been built from fear, from money, from the silence of everyone around him, and from his mother's death. A cold draft from the air conditioning moved through the ballroom, making a few decorative candles tremble. The lights were still as bright as before, but everything seemed to have changed color. The white-covered tables, the expensive flower arrangements, the towering wedding cake, the perfectly tailored suits, all of it suddenly looked small and absurd beside what was happening now. Because when truth enters a room, luxury is no longer enough to make people look decent. Chief Ibrahim looked at his son. For the first time that night, something close to breathlessness appeared in his eyes. Not quite remorse. A man like him had probably lived with his choices for too long to call it that. But there was shock. There was fracture. The collapse of a man who had never imagined that the empire he controlled so completely would one day be broken open from the place he believed was most loyal, his son. The son he had raised with discipline, image, and direction. The son now standing before him not as his heir, but as a living indictment. Not a single person in the ballroom was still on Chief Ibrahim's side. No one needed to announce it. No one needed to condemn him aloud. Truth has its own way of doing that. It does not need to scream. It only needs to exist. Adwale lowered his hand. His shoulders were still straight, but there was now a human wariness in his eyes. There was no winner in this moment. Only a son who had finally called a crime by its true name, and a father who had at last been stripped of the ability to hide behind beautiful titles. Somewhere deep inside himself, Adwale knew this moment would follow him for the rest of his life. Not the slap, not the crowd, not the scandal that would certainly explode after tonight. But the moment he understood that some people do not need blood on their hands to be killers. They only need to stand and watch, only need to stay silent, only need to place their own interests above another person's cry for help. And tonight, in one of the most luxurious hotels in Lagos, in the wedding that should have been the happiest day of his life, Adwale had spoken aloud what no one had dared say for years, not to humiliate his father, not for revenge, but to end a lie that had lived far too long on the back of his mother's death. The entire ballroom remained silent, because some climaxes do not need shouting. They are strongest when everyone understands that from this moment on, Chief Ibrahim Danjuma would never again be able to return to being the man he was yesterday. No one was the first to speak. After Adwale's final words, the entire ballroom fell into a silence, so complete it felt almost surreal. The chandeliers still poured warm gold across the polished marble floor. The white floral arrangements still stood motionless on the banquet tables, as if they had no idea that in just a few minutes, this place had transformed from a lavish wedding into the graveyard of a family. The towering wedding cake remained untouched. The wine glasses still shimmered, but all that beauty now looked like nothing more than an expensive decoration spread over ashes. Adwale stood still for a long time. No one knew what he was looking at. Maybe the darkened lead screen. Maybe the shattered glass near the stage. Maybe some part of his life inside him had just fallen and broken in a way that could never be repaired. Then, slowly, he lowered his eyes to his hand. His ring finger still carried the wedding band, a small piece of metal that was supposed to symbolize a beginning, a promise, a future home, a new life. But how could a man step into marriage in the same moment? He had just buried the last illusion he ever had about his father. How could he vow to build a family when the very definition of family inside him had just been stripped down to the bone? Adwale raised his hand. It did not tremble. It only moved slowly, very slowly, as if every motion weighed 10 times more than it should have. He removed the ring. The faint scrape of metal slipping free was so soft it was almost inaudible. But in that breathless ballroom, the sound rang out as clearly as the final lock clicking shut behind an old life. He set the ring down on the table. Click, only the slightest sound, but it was sharp enough that several guests blinked as if they had just witnessed something too painful to keep looking at. Zainab stood across from him. A few minutes earlier, she had been the bride in a flawless white gown, her face carefully made up for what was supposed to be the most beautiful moment of her life. Now all that preparation suddenly felt distant, almost cruel in its sadness. The veil still fell softly behind her. The stones sewn into the dress still caught the light, but her eyes no longer held the brightness of a woman waiting for wedding vows. They were filled with broken pieces. She looked at the ring on the table, then at Adwale, and for one very brief second, they understood each other in a way no words could have done better. Zainab did not step forward. She did not grab his hand. She did not ask, why? She did not collapse into sobs and turn this tragedy into one more romantic performance. Because she understood. She understood that the man standing before her was not leaving because he no longer loved her. He was walking away from a ritual that no longer belonged to life. He had just lost something greater than a wedding. He had just lost a family, or more precisely, lost the belief that he had ever truly had one. And in the middle of that pain, no decent woman could ask him to stay here, smile for the cameras, recite vows, cut cake, dance, as if his heart had not just been torn out of his chest. At last, tears spilled from Zainab's eyes, but she remained where she was. She only gave the slightest nod, a very small nod, not forgiveness, not full acceptance, just understanding for a wound she could not heal, but enough humanity not to press salt into it. Adwale looked at her. For the first time all night, his eyes softened. No more fire, no more ice, only exhaustion. A deep exhaustion, the kind that comes when a person has fought the truth for too long. And once he finally speaks it aloud, the strongest part of him is gone too. He seemed about to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe thank you. Maybe something for the innocent woman dragged into this night of ruin. But he said nothing. Because there are apologies that, no matter how sincere, are still too small when placed before a dream just buried on its own wedding stage. On the other side, Chief Ibrahim was still standing there, alone. The most frightening part was not that he had been exposed. It was the way he had been left behind. No handcuffs. No formal condemnation. No one rushing in to denounce him with the loud drama people imagine in films. Only the truth, and a crowd no longer standing with him. The man who had once entered every room, surrounded by admirers, now stood among hundreds of guests, without a single protective glance left for him. The business partners, who once competed to toast him, now avoided his eyes. The people who had praised him as a symbol of responsibility, now stood farther away, as if another few seconds too close to him might stain what little conscience they still had. Chief Ibrahim's power had not yet vanished from legal documents. The money in his accounts had not disappeared. The buildings still carried his name. But something had died here tonight. Trust. And when that dies, every empire begins to rot from the inside. He turned to look at the faces around him, as if he still had not fully accepted that this was real. His whole life, he had been used to people believing the version of himself that he told them. He had grown used to the idea that if he stayed calm enough, powerful enough, generous enough at the right moments, every suspicion would eventually sink. But tonight, no strategy could save him from the eyes of the people who had just watched the truth. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, maybe to explain, maybe to justify, maybe to find a word that sounded less brutal than indifference. But he could not, because even he understood now. After a video like that, language was no longer a tool of control. It only made the emptiness of itself more obvious. An older woman was the first to pick up her handbag. Not hurried, not dramatic, just an ordinary gesture so painful it was almost unbearable. She stood, gave the stage one final glance, then turned away. After her, a man at the table near the doors. Then another couple. Then more. The guests began to leave. Not loudly, not chaotically. No one gossiped in raised voices as if afraid of disturbing the atmosphere. Just footsteps leaving the ballroom, one after another, steady and cold, like a sentence being pronounced through silence. No one wanted to remain any longer than necessary as a witness to the collapse. No one wanted to pose for photos, raise another glass, make polite conversation, or pretend this was still an event that could be rescued by ceremony and manners. No, there was nothing left to save tonight. The grand doors of the ballroom opened and closed again and again. Groups of guests disappeared into the brightly lit hotel corridors, carrying in their eyes a story that by morning all of Lagos would know. But even before anyone posted a word online, even before the press caught the scent of it, judgment had already begun here, in the way people refused to look at Chief Ibrahim, in the way they chose to leave, rather than hear another word from him. That was the first punishment, and often the most painful, not being screamed at, but having every scrap of respect you spent a lifetime collecting quietly withdrawn. Zainab stepped back from the center of the stage. She did not run after Aidwale, nor did she go stand beside Chief Ibrahim. She remained in between, in that place where, would pain not let her fully belong to either side, but dignity kept her upright enough not to collapse in front of the crowd. Aidwale watched the guests leave. He did not call them back, did not offer more explanation, did not ask anyone to stay, because he understood better than anyone that there are nights when, once the truth has finally been spoken, what remains is not repair, but endurance, and the consequences of truth always fall on everyone, not only the person who caused the wrong, not only the one who exposed it, but also the innocent people standing too close. That is the cruelest part, and also the truest. At last, Chief Ibrahim sat down in the nearest chair. Very slowly. For the first time that night, he looked visibly older, not because of his gray hair, not because his face had gained more lines, but because the aura around him was gone. When a person lives too long through an image, the death of that image takes more from him than age ever could. He sat there, in a ballroom, gradually emptying around him, alone, No secretary, no business partners, no friends, no son, no hand resting on his shoulder. No voice telling him everything would be all right, because some things will never be all right again. No matter how much money a man has, no matter how much power he holds, no matter how many times he has successfully hidden the truth before. Adwale turned. He did not look back at the stage, did not look back at the ring, did not give his father one last glance the way movies like to offer audiences a final moment of softness, because he knew his softness had already been tested for years. And if he turned back tonight, maybe everything would become a circle again of weakness, of delay, of beautiful lies. He could not allow that. Not after everything his mother had endured. He walked toward the exit. Every step was heavy, but not hesitant. Behind him, the wedding lights still burned. The flowers still smelled sweet. The white ribbons still stirred gently in the cool air. Everything was still beautiful in a way that now felt like mockery. But ahead of him, for the first time in many years, the road might be more painful, more lonely, but at least it was real. There are prices that cannot be erased. No apology can erase a childhood raised inside lies. No empire can erase the moment a woman begged for help and was left behind. No wedding, no matter how beautiful, can cover the truth of a buried death, and no sun can walk out of a night like this still whole. But sometimes, the price of truth is not something to avoid. It is something that must be paid. If you still want to live without despising your own conscience. That night, in a luxury hotel in Lagos, a wedding ended before the vows were ever spoken. A father lost the legend of his life. A bride lost the happiest day she was meant to have. And a son lost the last family still living inside him. In exchange for the one thing no one had dared, return to his mother for all those years. The truth. There are fathers who teach their sons how to walk into powerful rooms, who teach them how to make money, who teach them how to become someone society respects, but forget the most important thing, how to be a human being. The truth in this story is not just a video, not just a slap. It's the moment a son is forced to choose. Stay silent to protect the family's honor, or break everything to keep his own conscience. If you were Adwale, what would you do? Stay silent so everything remains peaceful, or speak the truth, even if it costs you everything. Leave your thoughts in the comments. There is no absolute right or wrong, but every choice comes with a price. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city below. Let's see how far this story has reached across the world. And if you believe that truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be told. Justice, even when delayed, must still be served. Hit subscribe now, because the next story will keep you hooked from the very first second.